Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that the information in this presentation is not to be or construed as investment advice. The information presented are subject to change without notice, and while we have made every reasonable effort to ensure that the content is reliable and accurate, we have not independently verified the content and are not responsible for errors therein. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the IceCap Canadian Market Wrap with me, Richard Diaz. In this week's episode, we are going to review some of the data that will help us inform our view on what's going on with Canadian households. It's important to flag that it's not all bad. And so we'll start out this week's video with some of the good news regarding Canadian consumers and households. So let's get started. The good. The first piece of good news is consumer confidence. Despite the growing number of negative headlines and my insistence that Canada is already in a recession, we see from the following chart that consumer confidence bottomed late last year and has in fact been creeping higher. Maybe it's a stretch because when compared to history, we can see that the number is a step down, but nevertheless, the direction of travel has improved over the last year. The next chart is wage growth. In nominal terms, that is to say not adjusted for inflation. It is another data point that sticks out for the right reasons. And yes, believe it or not, it is rising. Additionally, the small business survey from the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses suggests that wage plans are still positive, but as you can see, it's starting to drop off a little bit. Now, I know some of you guys are rolling your eyes at the idea that wage growth data is so strong. So here I've plotted two other methods that corroborate the labor force survey data. Both the growth in total employee compensation, which includes benefits, and the rate of change in unit labor costs, another measure of how much a business pays for its workers, are in fact rising, and they're almost exactly the same number. However, I wouldn't be me if I didn't point out an important wrinkle in this wage data, and that is government compensation is propping up a wage growth in general for Canada, or so says a senior economist from Desjardins. We talked about the outsized contribution to employment growth that the government has had over the last 2 years. Well, here's a way that it can manifest. And this doesn't even address the crowding out effect on small businesses. The last good thing is this decent employment growth. We've seen that over the last 3 months, it's been clipping along about 26,000 per month. However, like we mentioned in episode 8, that since January 2023, roughly half that job growth is from the public sector. And that is both highly unusual and ultimately bad for productivity in Canada. Nevertheless, the numbers remain positive. So that was not the best list of goods, I'll admit. And the title of our Halloween special is a household horror show. So that's all we've got. But if you can think of some of the stuff I may have missed or things you'd like to see, please put them in the comments and I'll do my best to incorporate them in an update on Canadian households over Christmas. So what's our first bad chart? So sticking with the labor market for just a second, I want to reiterate that there are not enough jobs for all the newcomers. And despite the recent changes to the immigration policy, the unemployment rate fell to a now 25-year low, ex-COVID of course. And another thing to note in this chart is the decline in the participation rate. This is not good. We've left out the unemployment rate this week because we talked about it 2 weeks ago, but that's also been rising. And for young people, it's at a 15-year high. So watch this space. The next chart makes it clear that households are not spending. And you can see this in the chart from RBC Economics. Per capita retail sales adjusted for inflation are in decline. Consumers are tapped out. And I'll flag RBC's use of the word abysmal. With the labor market weak and about to get worse, we can only see this continuing to decline. The next bad chart is the savings rate, measured as the amount Canadians set aside from disposable income expressed as a percentage. When the pandemic forced Canadians into lockdown and consumption cratered, the rate surged to abnormal levels, and you can see that spike right there in 2020. Now it's rising again, but this time it is economic uncertainty that is pushing Canadians to save at a rate not seen in decades. Savings are up, spending is down. The question you might be asking is why? Or what's the ugly? And the answer is something I think everyone might have been able to guess. The truth is that the doubling of interest payments is really quite ugly. This chart is the aggregate or total household interest payments in billions. And you can see what has happened over the last few years split out into consumer credit and mortgage debt, gray and red lines. What this means is that debt service ratios, interest payments relative to disposable income, are at all-time highs for households. And this is putting pressure on other types of spending and pressure on the largest part of our GDP, consumption. Remember from episode 3, businesses are not spending either, and thus are not able to pick up the slack. As always, context is super important. So here is Canadian households compared to other advanced economies. Pretty ugly. But Rich, you'll say, interest rates are falling. And yes, that's true. As you can see, interest rates help determine the path of, in this case, mortgage payments, and they have indeed fallen. And that's the red line here, with the blue line being the mortgage component of the debt service ratio chart we just saw a second ago. The problem is that there's way more mortgage debt than there was 10 or 15 years ago, as you can see from this chart. This is mortgage debt and consumer credit as a percentage of GDP. It has nearly doubled over the last 10 to 15, 20 odd years. Again, you'll say, how does this compare? And again, I'll say, it's ugly. If you add up mortgage debt and consumer credit, you get about 100% of GDP, and that's what you see here. Canada is again at the top of the table, a dubious honor, and now 30% higher than the US. The final piece today is to share some of the work done by the Bank of Canada. And it reiterates the problems Canadians face and how they will not necessarily be able to avoid much higher mortgage payments and the knock-on effects to retail sales, consumption, and of course, growth more generally, especially in a time with weak labor markets as the undercurrent. The BOC modeled an expected path of interest rates, and that's what you can see at the top right-hand side of this slide. The light blue line shows the Bank of Canada overnight target rate falling all the way to 2.5%. But even in that scenario, we can see that mortgage payments are expected to increase by $200, $300, $400 a month in some cases. Now, $200 or $300 a month might not sound like a lot to some people, and that's fair enough. But multiply that by 12 months in a world where you have weaker labor markets, and that is not a pretty sight. In fact, I would say that's a pretty ugly outlook. So the idea that the Bank of Canada will be able to cut interest rates as they have, and perhaps even more, and for that to be some sort of panacea for households, to me, is a mistake. Canadians have some of the highest debt levels in the world. Their debt service ratios are at all-time highs, and again, at some of the highest in the world. And until they work through some of that debt, either by paying it down, which is bad for growth, or defaulting, which is also probably bad for growth, or by having a major increase in their income or wages, which is difficult at a time when the labor market is starting to creak and crack, it is not a good outlook. So that's a wrap for this week's episode. Thanks for listening. Please like, subscribe, and follow for more. And as always, feel free to get in touch with me. I'll be happy to answer your questions over email.